Redmond, Washington. Somewhere inside Microsoft's headquarters, a single email landed on April 8th, 2026. And by the time anyone finished reading it, the company had already lost 2.5 million customers. Not to a rival with a flashy new product, not to a marketing campaign, to a government, to an operating system that has existed quietly, stubbornly for free since 1991. And the most unsettling part isn't the number. It's that Microsoft almost certainly saw it coming and still had absolutely nothing in its playbook built to stop it. Because this was never really a story about software. It's a story about power, about who a nation trusts with its secrets, and about the moment a government looked at one of the most valuable corporations on Earth and quietly decided the relationship wasn't worth the price anymore. Here's exactly what happened, and why what comes next might be the beginning of the end for Microsoft's grip on European government computing. On that morning in April, France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, DINUM, issued a directive that didn't whisper, it commanded. Every ministry of the French government, every civil servant, the tax authorities, the Interior Ministry, every corner of the French state, covering roughly 2.5 million individual workstations, was ordered to submit a formal plan to migrate off Windows and onto Linux by autumn 2026. Read that again. This wasn't a pilot program quietly buried in some forgotten department, the kind that dies in 18 months once nobody's watching. This was a mandate, government-wide, with a deadline. And it went further than Windows alone. The directive named collaboration tools, antivirus software, AI platforms, and core databases as targets for the exact same treatment. This wasn't France swapping one operating system for another. This was France attempting a full, coordinated divorce from American technology infrastructure, executed at the scale of an entire nation. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone still assuming this was some knee-jerk political stunt. It wasn't spontaneous. 2 months earlier, in February 2026, France had already ordered all 2.5 million civil servants to stop using Microsoft Teams, Zoom, WebEx, and GoToMeeting entirely, replacing them overnight with a homegrown platform called Visio, built on open source code and hosted entirely on French sovereign servers. The Windows directive wasn't the opening move. It was the second, much larger domino in a sequence that had clearly been engineered for years, not decided over a weekend. So why would a national government willingly walk into this much operational chaos when renewing a Windows license and moving on would have been infinitely easier? The answer isn't one reason, it's three, and each one lands like a separate blow to Microsoft's business model. The first is money, and the number is almost too large to feel real. France hasn't published its exact annual Windows spend, but independent analysts estimate the full migration, hardware, software development, staff retraining, infrastructure, will cost somewhere between 1.5 and 3 billion euros, spread across a 5 to 7 year rollout. Linux costs nothing to license. Nothing. It's free, open source, maintained by a sprawling global community with no invoice attached, ever. Once the transition completes, the recurring payment that has flowed out of the French treasury and into Microsoft's revenue every single year simply stops, permanently. Framed that way, the real question isn't why France finally did this. It's why it took this long. But the second reason cuts deeper than any budget line, and it has a name: sovereignty. Stop and actually sit with what it means for a government to run its entire digital nervous system on software. It does not own, cannot inspect, and cannot independently verify. Every ministerial memo, every classified database query, every sensitive internal communication flowing through code designed, owned, and controlled by a foreign corporation operating under a foreign country's laws. France has no real way to audit what that closed source code is actually doing beneath the surface. It has to take Microsoft's word for it. For an individual user, that's a shrug-worthy inconvenience. For a government handling national security, just trust us, stops being an acceptable answer the moment you say it out loud. Linux flips that entire equation. Every line of code is public. Every function is auditable by France's own security services, with nothing hidden, nothing running quietly in the background that can't be examined. That's not a minor technical footnote. And for a government that has built its entire strategy around the words digital sovereignty, that transparency is the whole point of the exercise. And then there's the third reason, the one Microsoft would clearly prefer stayed out of every headline about this story: data. By default, Windows continuously collects telemetry about how it's being used and quietly sends that information back to Microsoft servers, something the company frames as a feature, a way to improve the product. On your personal laptop, that's mildly annoying at worst. Across 2.5 million government machines processing the most sensitive data a nation possesses, it becomes an entirely different category of problem, one that no enterprise privacy setting fully solves, because the collection isn't a setting. It's baked into the architecture itself. It can be managed. It can never be fully removed. Linux carries none of that by default. Nothing leaves the system unless the organization deliberately builds it to. And for a government that has staked its political credibility on the language of sovereignty, that single fact is what makes the other two reasons impossible to argue against. Now here is where this story stops being merely interesting and starts becoming genuinely remarkable, because France isn't attempting this blind. It already has a working foundation, and its origin is one of the strangest, quietest footnotes in modern government technology. Deep inside the French Gendarmerie, the National Police Force, engineers built their own custom Linux distribution years ago and called it Gendbuntu, based on Ubuntu. Nobody outside a small circle of IT staff paid it any attention. The Gendarmerie began migrating away from Windows back in 2008. And today, more than 100,000 of its computers have run on that Linux foundation for over 15 years, quietly producing real cost savings and real independence from foreign software the entire time. That is not a rumor, not a talking point cooked up for a press release. It's 17 years of documented operational boots-on-the-ground evidence, and Dynam is now pointing directly at it as proof that a migration at national scale isn't just a politically appealing slogan. It's something France has already, quietly, proven it can do. Nobody in 2008 set out to eventually rewrite Microsoft's entire relationship with the French government. A handful of engineers just wanted an operating system they could actually trust. And nearly 2 decades later, that decision has scaled up to 2.5 million desks. But before this starts sounding like an inevitable success story, it needs a hard dose of honesty, because government Linux migrations have failed before, publicly, expensively, and in ways that still haunt every IT department that remembers them. The most infamous case is Munich. In the early 2000s, the city launched a serious, well-funded effort to move its entire government onto Linux, and it collided head-on with exactly the kind of friction that kills these projects. Printer drivers that worked flawlessly on Windows barely functioned, or didn't exist at all, on Linux. Microsoft Office files refused to render cleanly in open-source alternatives. City employees who had spent decades building muscle memory around one specific interface suddenly had to relearn how to do their own jobs. Munich's migration became internationally famous, and not for the reason the city hoped. Years later, it partially reversed course, and ever since, it has been the go-to cautionary tale wheeled out by anyone arguing that this exact kind of transition simply cannot work at scale. France knows that history intimately, and unlike Munich 20 years ago, France isn't walking in with nothing. It has a seasoned technical team inside the Gendarmerie that has already fought through printer drivers, file compatibility, and staff retraining at meaningful scale. It has an explicit mandate from the highest levels of national government, not a single city council acting mostly alone. Whether that combination is enough to avoid repeating Munich's fate is the single biggest open question hanging over this entire project. And nobody, not Dynam, not Microsoft, not a single analyst watching from the outside, can honestly answer it yet. And France is far from alone in running this exact calculation. In Germany, the state of Schleswig-Holstein began migrating 30,000 government workstations onto Linux and LibreOffice back in 2023. By early 2026, that migration had reached roughly 80% completion, and the state reported 15 million euros in licensing savings in a single year alone. That's not a hypothetical projection on a slide deck. That's a live, running demonstration of the exact financial logic France is now applying at nearly 100 times the scale. Italy runs Linux across parts of its military infrastructure. Spain maintains its own government Linux distribution. Across the continent, officials have started calling this movement by its real name, digital sovereignty, built on the belief that a nation should control the software running its government, not rent permanent dependence on a foreign corporation for it. In January 2026, the European Parliament formally voted to direct the European Commission to identify every area where the EU could meaningfully cut its reliance on non-European technology providers. France's April 8th directive is widely seen as the first serious operational answer to that resolution. Not a report gathering dust in Brussels, but an actual binding order with an actual deadline being executed right now. And if France's migration succeeds, and that if matters enormously, because nothing about this outcome is guaranteed, the consequences ripple far beyond Dynam's own IT budget. Every government across Europe, and plenty outside it, will be watching closely to see whether the transition is genuinely manageable, whether the projected savings actually materialize, and whether French civil servants adapt without the visible chaos that sank Munich 2 decades ago. Because if the answer comes back yes, the single argument Microsoft's entire enterprise sales strategy has quietly rested on for decades, that switching away from Windows at scale is simply too disruptive, too risky, too expensive to seriously attempt, gets tested by the largest, most public, most closely watched case study it has ever faced. So what does Microsoft actually stand to lose here beyond the raw licensing revenue? Start with the money itself. Even without an exact published figure, that €1.5 to €3 billion migration estimate hints at the scale of value currently flowing from the French Treasury into Microsoft's accounts every single year, just to keep 2.5 million machines licensed and running. But the deeper wound isn't this one contract. It's the story that contract represents. For decades, Microsoft's government and enterprise sales pitch has rested on an argument nobody ever needs to say out loud, because it's baked into the default assumption of every IT department on Earth. Switching is too disruptive to attempt, so the rational choice is always to stay. France's migration, if it works, is the biggest, most public stress test that assumption has ever endured, watched in real time by every finance ministry in Europe, quietly running its own version of the same cost-benefit math behind closed doors. So what can Microsoft actually do about it? It could try to compete purely on price, walking into Paris with a steep discount designed to make the migration's cost look irrational by comparison. That's the obvious move and also the most dangerous one, because the moment Microsoft cuts France a special deal, it's effectively admitting the original price was never really justified in the first place. It could build a stripped-down France-specific version of Windows. No telemetry, full code audit access, every objection addressed directly. Microsoft has done custom government builds before, but it runs straight into the exact same trust problem that started this whole migration. Though France would still be relying entirely on Microsoft's word that the modified product does exactly what it promises, with no independent way to verify that claim at the code level. And the entire premise of this directive is that French officials have already concluded that kind of trust in a foreign vendor is no longer something the state is willing to extend. Or Microsoft could simply wait, say nothing publicly, quietly calculate the odds that the migration stumbles badly enough over the next few years to get walked back the way Munich's eventually was. History gives Microsoft some real reason to make that bet, but France has something Munich never had at the starting line: a working, 17-year-old operational foundation already proven at scale, and a political mandate framed explicitly around national sovereignty rather than short-term cost savings. The kind of justification that tends to survive budget pressure and vendor pushback far better than a purely financial argument ever could. And here's what Microsoft actually appears to be doing, based on the only real evidence available: nothing. When TechCrunch reached out for comment on France's directive, the company's entire on-record response was 2 words: no comment, no press release, no executive statement, no public counteroffer, no reassurance to its other government clients that this is an isolated incident rather than the opening move of a continental pattern. Or worse, that silence is not proof Microsoft hasn't noticed. A company with 30 years of institutional memory of exactly how the Munich story played out in the press does not need to be told what a headline like this can do to a decades-old narrative. The silence almost certainly means the opposite. That very serious, very careful conversations are happening behind closed doors in Redmond right now about what this means for Microsoft's entire European government business, and about how loudly other finance ministries across the continent are listening for even the faintest sign of weakness. When a company this size says absolutely nothing about something this significant, it isn't because the significance was missed. It's because the right answer hasn't been decided yet. And that hesitation, in its own quiet way, tells you exactly how seriously this is being taken behind closed doors. Zoom out, and the stakes stretch far past France's own borders. The European Parliament's resolution didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from years of mounting discomfort among European officials about how deeply embedded American technology has become inside the continent's most sensitive government systems. Our discomfort, that's been building alongside a steady drumbeat of EU antitrust fines and privacy enforcement actions against major American tech firms. France's April 8th directive is, by a wide margin, the most concrete, most operationally serious expression of that discomfort any major European government has produced so far. Not a report sitting on a shelf gathering dust. A binding order with a deadline, backed by 17 years of real technical proof. And it is already being watched closely in Berlin, in Rome, in Madrid, and in finance ministries well beyond Europe's edges. Underneath the political announcement sits a genuinely demanding set of mechanics that deserves honest attention rather than blind optimism or reflexive dismissal. Dynam's own roughly 350 internal systems are serving as the proof of concept phase, migrating before the wider ministries move at all, giving France a controlled space to catch the worst technical failures early instead of discovering them simultaneously across 2.5 million desks at once. Every ministry has until autumn 2026 to submit a formal roadmap, and full deployment across the entire civil service isn't expected to finish until 2030 at the earliest, a long runway that gives France room to adjust course if specific ministries run into the exact printer driver and file format friction that derailed Munich, without the whole national effort collapsing over a single bad quarter. That patience, engineered directly into the timeline, might be the single biggest structural difference between what France is attempting now and what Munich attempted, with far less runway 2 decades ago. None of this guarantees success, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Our 2.5 million civil servants, many of whom have used the same interface, the same file structures, the same muscle memory workflows for their entire careers, are going to sit down one morning at a machine that looks and feels different in ways both large and small. Simple tasks that used to take 30 seconds may briefly require calling a colleague for help. Printing, as mundane as that sounds, has historically been one of Linux's most persistent weak points in exactly this kind of enterprise rollout, and years of Microsoft Office files will need to open cleanly on open source alternatives that have improved enormously but still aren't flawless in every edge case. When a critical government document fails to open on the one morning it's actually needed, the fallout isn't just one frustrated employee. It becomes a headline. It becomes ammunition for everyone who said, from day one, that this entire migration was a mistake. France is walking in with its eyes fully open to that risk, which is exactly why the rollout is staged deliberately across ministries and years, instead of attempted as a single overnight cutover. And underneath all of it sits a question far bigger than France, far bigger than Linux, and far bigger than any one company's quarterly earnings call. What happens to the relationship between a sovereign government and the software running its most sensitive operations? OS. The moment that government decides dependence on a single foreign vendor is itself the risk, regardless of how reliable that vendor's product has been for years, that isn't fundamentally a technology question. It's a question about power, about who ultimately answers to whom once a piece of infrastructure becomes essential to how a modern state functions every single day. France looked directly at an institution it had depended on for decades, calculated the full compounding cost of that dependence across money, control, and data, and concluded the price had finally become too high to keep paying quietly. This doesn't end cleanly, and it doesn't end soon. The rollout stretches to 2030 at the earliest. The exact risks that sank Munich haven't disappeared just because France has a better foundation and more patience this time around. And Microsoft's genuine on-record response, 2 flat words, no comment, tells you a company this large hasn't yet decided what story it wants to tell every other government client watching what just happened in Paris. What unfolds over these next 4 years, whether this migration holds together the way Schleswig-Holstein's smaller version already has, whether it stumbles the way Munich's famously did, or whether it becomes the working blueprint that Germany, Italy, and Spain quietly scale up to match, is going to be one of the most consequential technology stories to come out of Europe this decade. And it is still being written, in real time, not looked back on as a finished outcome.